Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Ghostal Living by Kathleen Bridge, narrated by Vanessa Daniels. Chapter 1. It was an understatement to say that I, Meg Barrett, had too much on my plate. My plate, a new cottage in Montauk overlooking the Atlantic, was piled so high I couldn't see under the minutia of zoning permits and small-town politics. Luckily, the ready-to-topple cake on top of my plate was layered with rich chocolate ganache, consisting of romance with two men, a major score at a recent estate sale, and a temperate Long Island August deserving a place in the history books, notwithstanding the hurricane that planned to make landfall at 1300. The vintage boat, or yacht, as I was told to call the Malabar X, listed from side to side, making it impossible to balance the crate holding Joe, my 23-pound one-eyed feline. Thanks to one of my aforementioned love interests, the 60-foot, circa 1920 vessel had been my summer abode while I waited for zoning approval on my new cottage. While I'd spent the past 3 months living on a yacht moored at the ritzy East End Yacht Club in Montauk, Joe had bunked with Georgia, proprietor of the Old Man and the Sea books. Septuagenarian Georgia was on a week-long bike tour in Maine, and I was left with the task of confining my Maine coon to the cabin of the yacht. The vintage sailboat had been my cat's home for only a week. A very long week. I placed Joe on the cracked pleather front seat of the Wrangler and took one last look at the Malabar X. Gargantuan waves pounded her hull. Due to the hurricane barreling up the East Coast, a mandatory evacuation had been issued in Montauk for anyone living south of Route 27. The yacht club was north of the highway, but I wasn't taking any chances. In the Great Hurricane of 1938, water flooded across the Napeague Dunes and turned Montauk into an island. The entire downtown had to be moved 3 miles south. Once inside the Jeep, I said, "I promise, Miss Josephine, soon you'll be on solid ground." She wasn't going for it and started howling. The decibel level was higher than when I'd switched her gourmet cat food for another brand on sale. In Montauk, police cars were stationed at every beach entrance, barring surfers lugging heavy boards from partaking in the record-breaking waves. On South Elmwood Avenue, the Fudge Shop, and a little bit of everything, had wisely boarded up their plate glass windows. I was happy I'd found a safe port for Joe and me in Sag Harbor. In East Hampton, Joe's mewing intensified, along with the gale-forced winds. On Main Street, a herd of 5'10" sun-kissed models window-shopped, daring the hurricane to grace the gold-paved streets. As if. 7 miles and 30 minutes later, we arrived in Sag Harbor. I turned onto Hollingsworth Avenue, went through the iron gates at the side of the Bibliophile Bed and Breakfast, and parked in the lot. The Victorian was the largest and most ornate in Sag Harbor. Franklin Hollingsworth owned the Bibliophile B&B. He shared the 10-acre estate with his brother Ollie. For the past 50 years, the mansion had sat in disrepair. Working side by side with the Sag Harbor Historical Society, and without his brother Ollie's help, Franklin invested over $1 million into the mansion's renovation. As a tribute to his favorite American authors, he transformed the old homestead into the Bibliophile Bed and Breakfast. My one-woman interior design firm, Cottages by the Sea, had been in charge of the decor in each of the inn's guest suites. During the past few months, the project had taken up most of my waking hours. I couldn't have done it without the help of my best friend and former co-worker at American Home and Garden magazine, Elle Warner. Elle had a thriving antiques vintage shop in Sag Harbor called Mabel and Elle's Curiosities, and was occasionally called in by First Fidelity Mutual, a local insurance company, to inventory art and antiques in the Hamptons area. We'd recently completed each American author-inspired suite, with the exception of the third-floor Emily Dickinson loft. The inn wasn't officially open to the public yet. A rare book collector, Franklin Hollingsworth had carefully chosen only a few upper-echelon bibliophiles to be his guests. Franklin had timed the inn's unofficial opening with the first annual Sag Harbor Antiquarian Book and Ephemera Fair, of which he was a founding father. The book fair was sure to be a success due to all the press surrounding Franklin's purchase of an unpublished F. Scott Fitzgerald manuscript. Franklin Hollingsworth had bought the F. Scott Fitzgerald manuscript, The Heiress and the Light, for the bargain price of $5 million at a local auction. The F. Scott Fitzgerald Trust was the only one with the right to publish the manuscript in novel form. However, Franklin, according to an article in Dave's Hamptons, said the ownership of The Heiress and the Light had been the pinnacle of his 50-year career. And what a career it had been! It was rumored Franklin spent a good share of his multi-million-dollar Hollingsworth inheritance on rare, first-edition books and manuscripts, making him one of the top book collectors in the United States. Even the Smithsonian had tried to buy some of Franklin's items for their collection. Franklin refused to sell, not even granting a short exhibit, which was probably the reason there was so much buzz about the viewing of The Heiress and the Light at Saturday's kickoff cocktail party for the book fair. The 1920s-themed gala was to take place at Hollingsworth Castle, Franklin's brother Ollie's newly built monstrosity. It was ostentatious with a capital O, just like Ollie himself. I was a huge Fitzgerald fan and looked forward to the book fair on Sunday. However, I had another reason for attending. During the time I worked on the interior rooms of the Bibliophile B&B, I'd gone to a nearby estate sale and found a signed, first edition, first printing of the John Steinbeck novel, The Winter of Our Discontent. A few days ago, I gave the book to Franklin's go-to rare book broker, who was staying at the inn. Jordan Inez valued my John Steinbeck book at $12,000. She told me the price could go even higher because the author had once been a resident of Sag Harbor. The fictional setting in Steinbeck's book, New Baytown, had been modeled after Sag Harbor. I'd found the Steinbeck buried in the bottom of a trunk, under a stack of old newspapers covered in mouse droppings. Vintage picking wasn't a glamorous job, even in the Hamptons. I felt less guilty about paying only $50 for a book valued in the thousands, because the owner of the house was a billionaire Wall Streeter, and for each treasure I profited from, there were always a few gambles that didn't pay off. But wasn't that the thrill of the hunt? With the low interior design rates I charged my cottages by the sea clients, the karmic sales seemed evenly balanced. I switched off the ignition. Joe was uncharacteristically quiet. Not a peep or a howl. It was the calm before the storm, the cats and the hurricanes. The Bibliophile B&B's parking lot was empty, except for one car, a navy blue Fiat. Perhaps the inn's guests were stocking up on snacks and board games to keep them busy while they were holed up inside. There wouldn't be any need to visit the bookstore on Main Street. The Bibliophile's obsolete greenhouse bloomed with a lending library of books. There were plenty of rare editions inside the inn, but most were locked behind glass bookcases. I got out of the Jeep, took my suitcase from the back, and admired the Victorian's architecture. The exterior was painted teal blue with white trim. Lush, wedding white hydrangea bushes bordered the sprawling wraparound veranda. The mansion was topped with a gold leaf cupola, reminiscent of the Taj Mahal's. Under the dome was an open perch with a circular wood railing offering 360-degree views of Sag Harbor. There were 4 turrets, one at each corner of the house, and fretwork decorated every wooden gable. I craned my neck and looked at the copper whale weather vane. The verdigris arrow determining the wind's direction spun frenetically left, then right, and back again. Dusty mauve clouds moved toward me from the harbor, and the wind lashed my face. It whistled and tunneled in and out of my hearing aids, producing an eerie soundtrack. Storm a-comin', storm a-comin'. Next to me, a flock of sparrows left a huge magnolia tree, scattering in all directions. These birds of a feather weren't sticking together. The sky darkened, and I jumped when I saw movement from behind a lace curtain in the Edgar Allan Poe suite. I'd designed the suite for atmosphere. Apparently, I'd done a stellar job. Chapter 2. I opened the Jeep's passenger door, and Jo gave me the evil eye through a hole in the crate. She only had one, but she sure knew how to use it. I thought we'd come a long way from when I'd been tricked into adopting her. However, the past week on the yacht had set our relationship back a few notches. I was thrilled we were staying in the unfinished Emily Dickinson loft. I could only imagine what damage Jo would do if I let her loose in one of the guest suites filled with antique and vintage linens. The inn's guests had been at the Bibliophile for 2 weeks. The suites booked were the F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Herman Melville, and the Edgar Allan Poe. The empty suites included the Louisa May Alcott, the John Steinbeck, and the Edith Wharton. Only 7 suites, including the Emily Dickinson loft, but when the inn officially opened, each suite would go for $800 a night off-season, with meals extra. Jo mewed as I grabbed the handle of the crate. A single talon poked through one of the holes. That's the girl I know and love. Brenna, Franklin's niece who ran the B&B, waited on the veranda at the rear entrance. Brenna was my age, in her early 30s, with coffee ground brown hair and olive skin. Her appearance was average in every way, except for one. She stood 6 feet tall. She reminded me of a young Julia Child, in looks and cooking ability. Hurry, Meg, before someone sees your cat. Guests weren't allowed pets. The inn came with its own well-behaved tortoiseshell feline named Katerina. Well-behaved and Jo would never be used in the same sentence. I leaned to the right, Quasimodo style, holding the crate in one hand while I dragged my suitcase over the gravel with the other. Brenna came toward us. She always dressed in khaki pants and a preppy, insignia-clad polo shirt. Welcome back. We've missed you. Sorry it had to be the same day as a hurricane. I don't think it'll hit too hard in Sag Harbor. I heard the South Shore will bear the brunt of it. Great. Don't worry, your cottage will be fine. My little Montauk bungalow sat on a half-acre of land and included a glass folly and a centuries-old garden. The panoramic ocean views from the cottage included the Montauk Point Lighthouse, the same light referred to in the title of Fitzgerald's unpublished manuscript, The Heiress and the Light. I gave Brenna a quick hug, and we walked to the rear entrance of the inn. Brenna grabbed the handle of the suitcase, pulled it up the wooden steps like it weighed nothing, then held open the door. We stepped into the rear vestibule, and I was immediately comforted with the sweet scent of beeswax. The inn served honey from its own apiary and made beeswax candles and furniture polish. I also noticed the distinctive smell of cardamom. When I'd worked on the guest suites at the Bibliophile, I enjoyed an array of memorable meals that Brenna had prepared from recipes she found in one of her vintage cookbooks. The book-collecting apple hadn't fallen far from the Hollingsworth tree. And like my foodie snob, gourmet cook father, Brenna added her own spin to each recipe she followed. Brenna carried my suitcase up to the Emily Dickinson loft, then left to make sure there were enough supplies in case we had a power outage. The beast was set free in the loft, which at one time had been a nursery/schoolroom. Jo spent the first few minutes doing a cursory inspection, then plopped down on the single bed under a long rectangular window. The loft spanned the entire width of the mansion, with ceilings that rose almost 2 stories high. Like every other room in the Victorian, it had its own fireplace. Also in the loft was a door that opened to stairs leading up to the cupola. I couldn't wait to climb them and check out the harbor view. A branch slammed against the window and Jo gave me a look like, "What have you gotten us into now?" It seems I'd have to wait for my bird's nest view of Sag Harbor until after the hurricane. On the east wall, I'd stacked antique and vintage furniture and accessories, similar to those I'd spied at the Emily Dickinson Museum in Massachusetts. The center guest suite on the second floor started out as the Emily Dickinson suite. After Franklin's purchase of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Heiress and the Light manuscript, the contents of the Dickinson guest suite were banished to the attic loft, and the F. Scott Fitzgerald suite was born. Elle and I had only a 1-month deadline to scour Long Island for items to fill the Fitzgerald suite. We traveled 85 miles west to Great Neck, where the Fitzgeralds once lived, and F. Scott penned The Great Gatsby. Then back east to the Hamptons, where F. Scott and Zelda most likely once romped, visiting every resale and vintage shop along the way. Elle and I had an unspoken rule of shopping mostly at local antique/vintage shops, and estate and garage sales for our furniture and accessories. We preferred our treasure hunts to be just that. In each author-inspired suite, I'd made the desk the focal point, like the author had just stepped out for a bit of air. The only items not of period in the rooms were the king-size down-topped mattresses. I was confident that when the Emily Dickinson loft was completed, even shy Emily would have preferred the cozy attic space to the second-floor guest suite. A replica of Miss Dickinson's cherrywood desk sat in front of an oriel window that faced the harbor. The Bibliophile B&B had 6 oriel windows, which Elle had explained were a type of bay window supported by brackets that jutted out from a wall with side windows designed to catch cool summer breezes before the advent of air conditioning. The harbor vista outside the window would have provided Emily with enough inspiration to pen a few hundred more poems to add to her bountiful repertoire. Like Emily's, the desk I'd chosen was more of a square-top writing stand. Small tables of this kind were usually used as work tables or sewing tables in the 19th century. At the end of the single bed was a flat-top trunk. On top of the trunk was a basket, its handle tied with a rope. The charming story went: Emily Dickinson would lower freshly baked gingerbread out her window for the neighborhood children of Amherst, Massachusetts to enjoy. A docent at the museum had told us Emily was a passionate baker and spent a good part of her time in her kitchen, occasionally writing lines of poetry on the backs of Parisian chocolate wrappers. On the west wall, in a cupboard under the rafters, was a storage space that housed trunks and boxes filled with antique items dating as far back as the mid-1800s. Franklin Hollingsworth said to toss anything that wasn't book-related. If it didn't have to do with books, he wasn't interested. His niece Brenna told me to feel free to rummage through the storage space for family heirlooms or small items that could be used in the Bibliophile B&B suites. Anything left over would be donated to the Sag Harbor Whaling and Historical Museum. Wind rattled the shutters. I went to the window and pushed up the sash. Then I leaned out, grabbed first the left shutter, then the right, and pulled them toward me. After latching them together, I closed the window. I'd used similar shutters as decor in many of my cottages, but had never before thought of their functional purpose during a storm. Through all the commotion, Joe's eye remained closed. Wanting to go out before the storm hit and we'd be quarantined indoors, I took advantage of the cat's sanguine position. I removed my hearing aids, knowing they'd be useless in the high winds, and placed them on top of an antique dresser. I grabbed my hoodie, then snuck down the back stairs and went out the rear door. The sky matched the color of the choppy bay. The scent of roses drew my gaze to a latticed trellis leaning against the north side of the inn. The roses were a pale yellow tinged with peach. They were so full and fragrant, I'd have bet they were heirloom blooms. Brenna had told me the Hollingsworths had been in Sag Harbor since the 1700s. They were one of the few Sag Harbor families who had come out unscathed after the collapse of the whaling industry, because they'd wisely invested their fortune in railroads and factories. In the mid-19th century, Ezekiel Hollingsworth, Franklin and Ollie Hollingsworth's great-great-grandfather, was the one who had transformed the white clapboard Greek Revival house into a ginormous Victorian. As I passed the inn's parking lot, I saw it was now filled with 4 vehicles, including mine. I ignored the no trespassing and private property signs posted on the second set of ornate iron gates at the back of the B&B and dashed through, thankful I didn't get zapped by an electric current. I had 3 choices on which way to go. The first path led to a decrepit, falling-in ruin Greek revival mansion I'd discovered on one of my wanderings. Scrimshaw House had been built so close to the eroding land above the harbor, it had been condemned by the village and had sat empty for the past 100 years. Scrimshaw House had belonged to the only Hollingsworth ancestor who'd been a whaling captain. The story went like this. When Captain Isaiah Hollingsworth's wife, Sarah, heard her husband's ship, Manifest Destiny, had sunk in a squall on its way to Honduras, she had a miscarriage. A day later, she wandered out into a storm and threw herself off a piece of land that jutted 50 feet above the rocky harbor. Sailors saw her floating in the water, her white nightgown spread around her like angels' wings. Supposedly, Captain Isaiah's widow haunted the bluff next to Scrimshaw House, ever searching the horizon for the safe return of Manifest Destiny. The locals renamed the piece of land from where Sarah had jumped Widow's Point. My second choice was a gravel drive that ended at Ollie Hollingsworth's castle. No, thank you. Ollie's castle didn't meld with the beautiful harborfront land it sat on. Hollingsworth Castle had an aluminum siding that mimicked large gray bricks, multiple Juliet balconies, ramparts, and turrets. Through the trees I saw the castle's double towers. I'd heard Ollie had cut down 45 oaks, maples, and elms to make room for his not-so-humble abode. He must have had a Sag Harbor councilman in his back pocket in order to get that, and the aluminum siding passed. And here I was waiting for zoning approval on a tiny 6-room cottage. My third choice was a dirt trail I'd never taken that led into the woods. I chose the woods. As I stepped onto the path, a huge branch from a 40-foot oak swept the ground like a gentleman asking a debutante for a dance. Then a voracious blast of wind ricocheted the branch upward. The limb severed, landing inches in front of me. The ground, along with my knees, shook. The wise thing would have been to turn around and go inside. No one ever said I was wise. I kept walking until I saw a red Japanese pagoda at the top of a hill. The pagoda had a slatted, triple-tiered, ogee roof with ornate wood carvings at each corner. 3 of the 4 sides of the pagoda had glass walls trimmed in red. My kind of cozy structure. A waterfall trickled down the side of the hill and emptied into a pond filled with neon-hued koi. Surrounding the pond were double begonias, perfumed ruffle-edged lilies, and ferns. I suspected that landscape architect Byron Hughes had something to do with its magnificence. Byron had recommended cottages by the sea to Franklin Hollingsworth. Byron was the #1 top man on the totem pole Hampton's landscape architect and my occasional Saturday night date. If I hadn't had Byron's competition, Cole Spencer, in my life, things would have been much easier, but not much fun. I couldn't ignore my feelings for both Byron and Cole. And why shouldn't I date 2 guys at the same time? My ex-fiancé had cheated behind my back with his ex-wife, Miss Fancy Pants Paige Whitney of Whitney Publications. Lately, things had been a little easier on the man front because Cole was delivering one of his vintage sailing yachts to a client in St. Thomas. I pulled out my cell phone to see if he'd left a message. He hadn't. I put my phone back in my pocket, noticing it had only 1 bar of battery left, and hurried over a small stone bridge, then climbed the steps to the top of the hill. In front of the pagoda were a rock garden, bonsai trees, and 2 weeping cherries. A light glowed from inside. I crouched under one of the weeping cherries and looked in. Violet Hollingsworth, Franklin's wife, sat at her sculpting table. She held a tool consisting of 2 small handles with a wire stretched between them and was in the process of slicing off the top of a large clay head. She removed the scalp portion and placed it next to her. As she worked, she conversed with the head, even pinching its cheekbones like she wanted to inflict bodily harm. Then she reached inside the head and removed a wad of crumpled newspapers and slid the scalpless head off a metal pole. Next, she went to work hollowing out the interior of the head with a tool that had a metal loop at its end, like something a dentist might use to torture his patients. In the past, when I'd worked at the inn, I rarely saw Franklin's wife. Violet left everything concerning the B&B in her niece Brenna's capable hands. Franklin and Violet lived in a small cabin behind the inn. The cabin had once been used as the main house's kitchen and cook's residence. Franklin was usually sequestered inside, nose deep in books, or in his private reading lair, a gutted smokehouse, windowless and temperature and humidity controlled. The smokehouse had enough high-tech security to keep his prized rare books and manuscripts, including The Heiress and the Light, safe. Brenna told me Violet spent most of her time in her studio. She and Franklin seemed a good match. Neither was boisterous or commanding. They were the complete opposite of Franklin's brother Ollie. A drop of rain landed on my nose. Not wanting to disturb Violet and feeling like a voyeur, I turned and sprinted down the hill. In front of me was the inn, and beyond it, a turbulent Sag Harbor bay. The wind picked up, if that was even possible. I looked toward the Bibliophile. It was the perfect backdrop for a Hitchcockian film. The landscape surrounding the estate seemed sopped of color by the black storm clouds. I'd believed Brenna and her mild Sag Harbor weather prognostication. But now I wasn't too sure. I hurried over the stone bridge, then broke into a run. The wind whipped my hair in front of my eyes, and I tripped over something on the rocky path. A book. Wow. Books just grew in the woods on the grounds of the Bibliophile B&B. I picked it up. It was a bound copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's short stories, originally published in the Saturday Evening Post. I opened the book. The pages fluttered violently back and forth. I shoved the book under my jacket and pulled up my hood. The sky let loose in its deluge. Rain, mixed with hail, pelted my head like a hydraulic jackhammer. The pagoda was closer than the inn. I turned and sprinted toward it. The hurricane had arrived. Chapter 3. I hurried along the path. It felt like I was inside a whack-a-mole arcade game. Small tree branches flew in horizontal trajectories, then dive-bombed to the ground. At the top of the hill, I climbed the 3 wooden steps and pounded on the glass door. Violet Hollingsworth's back faced me. Twigs and other forest shrapnel clawed at my bare legs. I rapped harder with the side of my fist. Violet turned, surprise showing in her pale gray eyes. She hurriedly placed the scalp on the head and covered the sculpture with black fabric. She floated toward the door, in no hurry to rescue me from the storm. She wore a caftan made of a diaphanous material in iridescent purples, greens, and blues. As she reached for the sliding glass door, her sleeves morphed into huge wings, and I couldn't help but think of the lead in the opera Madame Butterfly. I stepped, more like flew, inside, pushed by the unrelenting wind. There wasn't a chance I'd be able to get back to the Bibliophile until the storm let up. "Miss Barrett, what are you doing out on a day like this?" She had short lemon blonde hair. 2 shiny curls were flattened against her cheeks like they'd been lacquered with decoupage glue. Still holding the book under my jacket with one hand, I used the other to help Violet close the sliding glass door. The cuticles on her short nails were caked with clay. Violet noticed my stare and apologetically folded her hands into her sleeves. "I fear we'll become better friends in the next few hours, my dear." Her choice of using the word fear seemed slightly odd. The space was open and airy. I felt like I was on a different continent. An indoor fountain at the west-facing window emptied into a rock-filled pond glittering with goldfish. Flanked on both sides of the fountain were potted, dwarf bonsai trees and orchids. Their mouths gaped open to catch the moist air. The room smelled of damp earth and something sweet and familiar I couldn't make out. I said,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?